I'm delighted to be back. I'm delighted with the size of the audience. I think the audience is so large because it's a bad pool day. Welcome to Central Florida. Before I start my presentation, I want to do a shout out for INCOSE. And even though the bar's been set high, that Grant Begley is going to be a great keynote speaker, I'm delighted to be your sweep-up keynote speaker. But as I was invited in 2014, and this was my first introduction to INCOSE, was in 2014. Your David Long was the president of the organization then. And I was so favorably impressed with that event out in Las Vegas, and actually Henderson. I attended some of the tracks. I went to some of the panels. I was a keynote speaker. And I really walked away from that week event just impressed with this organization. And my initial thought was, you just had a good week. I've been delighted to be back here this week and to have arrived Saturday afternoon, be part of your panels going through Sunday and through the entire week. And I have come to the conclusion that you didn't just have a good week in Nevada in 2014, you're a great organization. And so here's the shout out. I want to do a shout out to your leadership with all sincerity. And because their unselfish contributions to this organization as volunteers and moving systems engineering forward is to absolutely be commended. My shout out is to you as participants. I have been so impressed interacting with you as individuals back in 2014 and also this year. I truly, with all sincerity, a shout out, and I would like the leaders to applaud you, the members, and the members to applaud the leaders. And my plan is after this conference, I'm going to join INCOSE. I'll become one of you. Even though I'm not a systems engineer. I have that aerospace aeronautical stuff, but I'm not a systems engineer. I am absolutely honored and delighted to be here today, as I was in 2014. And I'm honored because I am an engineer amongst engineers. And so it's just an honor to be here before you and talk about this opportunity of moving the world forward in the area of unmanned systems and robotics. I'm also delighted to be here, not so much for me, but for you. And here's why I'm delighted for you. You are absolutely advantagingly positioned as a profession and also as individuals to contribute in significant ways to the advancement of unmanned systems and robotics globally, and to do so ethically and responsibly. And my conversation today is going to be about the revolution. And I spoke to you on the same topic back in 2014, and to come back in 2019 and have the conversation again as an opportunity to show you how this revolution has moved forward. I want a quick show of hands. How many folks were in Vegas, Henderson, in 2014 for the INCOSE? Very good, very good. Okay, this is with risk. How many remember the forecast I gave for 2019? Good, excellent. No. No, and in fact, I bring that up as a point, and the numbers I provided back in 2014 were not Grant Begley made-up points. These weren't market projections and so forth. The numbers I share with you are, in fact, objective, citable numbers that come from credible references, whether it's a Teal Group, it's GAO reports, other documented areas. Now, what I will do in my conversation with you, I might round the numbers. If we're talking about $8.5 billion, I may round it to $8 billion or $9 billion. But in any case, the numbers are citable, and I invite you to go back and look at the numbers. Now, in preparation for today's conversation, what I did do is I went back and listened to my talk in 2014 with some anxiety. What did Grant say? And I'm pleased to report that, in fact, the numbers I provided you and the forecast I provided you were spot on, they're accurate, and this is the important thing for using things that are documented, actual documented numbers. Today I'm going to do like I did in 2014, since more than half the audience was not at the 2014 event. And I'm going to break my conversation up with you in 4 parts. One is going to be definition. So we're talking about the same type of thing. When we're talking about robotics or unmanned systems, what is it exactly you're talking about? So we'll do the definition, short period. And then we're going to go back to 2014. What was this revolution like in 2014? What were the market sizes? Who were the movers in 2014? And what were the forecasts to bring us up to today? Then the next part is going to be, here we are today, 2019. What has this revolution brought us to, and what does the future look like as we move forward? And then we'll go ahead and open the floors for questions and answers. Sound reasonable? All right. So let's go back. 2014, the definition I provided you back then for these various systems is as follows. When we speak of robotics, a robot typically is stationary. It may have a little bit of mobility, but generally stationary. And when we talk about robots, think of the assembly line of an automotive factory. General Motors, Toyota, and the robotic arm that's doing welding, is doing painting, is doing assembly. They don't move much, and in fact, those are industrial robots. And as a generality, a robot is a mechanical device that does a function or more than one function that a human would otherwise do, and does that function very well, probably better than the human, and probably it's a function the human didn't want to do anyhow. So basic definition of a robot, stationary, pretty simple, doing the functions, but there's two types of robots, and it's important to understand. There are industrial robots, the automotive robot, and there are the interactive, sort of the personal robots, and these are called service robots. So service robots is a new phenomena that really has grown since 2014. A service robot, different than an industrial robot, does have human interaction. The human's involved somehow, and in fact, since 2014, there's been a phenomena that these service robots are now being referred to as cobots, like a co-worker. So unlike an industrial automotive assembly line where the robots with the arms are painting and welding, a co-robot will work side by side with a person and enhance production in a small industrial environment, or it could be a service robot at a fast food location, making fast food, service robot. Let's go on to unmanned systems now. So unmanned systems, if I say drone, I'm sure that for all of you, real quickly, you go, he's talking about a drone, and that's the vehicle. But if I say an unmanned aerial system, that is a drone in an aviation environment, and it's a system. It's not just that vehicle that we're talking about, it's the entire system. It's a ground control system, it's the communications, it's everything that goes with that vehicle. So from a systems engineering perspective, this is what you need to be absolutely informed about, that we're talking about the total system, not just the vehicle. And then we take it on further, and we talk about the unmanned ground system. Different operational domain on the ground. And the unmanned ground system in our current technology is truly, truly a first cousin to the unmanned aerial system. And now we go to the unmanned maritime systems, surface vehicle as well as underwater vehicles. Again, these are systems. It's not just a vehicle, it's a system. And what we touched on a little bit back in 2014 was unmanned space systems. So again, when SpaceX goes to the International Space Station, the unmanned space system is not just the SpaceX rocket going up there and it's just nothing and that's done and then it comes back and recovers. It's a total system. It's the command and control, it's everything that goes with that. And in fact, what I find fascinating, Winston and I go way back, and aside from the 200 carrier landings versus 500, we're both from naval aviation and we kid each other. You think about why, at this anniversary, 50th anniversary for Apollo, it's very special. Why did we send humans to the moon? Because we couldn't send robots. We did not have the technology 50 years ago to send robots to the moon. And in 2014, just in November, after the INCOSE conference in Nevada, one of the top news releases for 2014, this was made the international news and is considered one of the top news items, the European Space Agency landed a probe on a comet after 10 years of transit. Think about that. Pretty special. That is an unmanned space system. And in the global market, I'll touch on space here for a second. In the global market, this year, the global space market value is $400 billion. And the predominance of that still is government controlled. It's not commercial. 2 weeks ago, I was absolutely delighted to have been invited and participated in the inaugural Space Expo Summit in Washington, D.C. that was co-hosted by the U.S. State Department, the Department of Commerce. We had the NASA administrator was there, and this is a current U.S. administration initiative to take the current $400 billion a year space industry to $1 trillion a year space industry market value in the next 5 years. Now, I share with you the predominance of that is going to be manned or unmanned space systems. And I submit it's going to be unmanned space systems. I fully support going back to the moon, humans to the moon, and humans to Mars, but keep in mind these are space systems and the predominance are going to be unmanned. This is part of the revolution. So we have the definitions, unmanned systems, robotics. Let me throw another one in for your consideration, and this is important. There is automation and there is autonomous. Big difference. And as computing power is becoming better, and in 2014 we talked about Moore's Law, and where the speed of computing and the capacity of computing was continuing to advance, the costs were coming down, and this is what is enabling us to go in these small robots, small unmanned systems. But as a result of that, we have now been able to go from having an individual fly a vehicle or drive a vehicle, that now you can have that vehicle become autonomous. So autonomous, and think of driverless cars, and we touched on driverless cars in 2014. Driverless cars have levels of autonomy from the car we have that we're driving today, which probably has very little autonomy, to level 5 of being autonomous. Level 5 is you can take the steering wheel out, you take the pedals out, and the vehicle can go through a complicated area, it can drive urban, it can go anywhere it wants to. It is fully autonomous. So now the system becomes the system of the vehicle, not just an automated system. An automated system, if you flew into Orlando National Airport and you dropped the tram over here, brought the tram into the terminal, that was an automated vehicle, the tram. The tram is on a track. There's no conductor on it. The tram is on a track. It can't get away, but it has automated functions. So big distinction, autonomous and automated for consideration. So now let's go back to 2014. What was going on in 2014? Let's start with robotic systems. So in 2014, the information from the International Federation of Robots, at the end of the year, at the end of 2014, stated that the total global market for robotics was $29 billion. $29 billion, total globe. This is robotics, to include the industrial robots as well as the service robots. Of that $29 billion, about 75% were industrial robots. Again, automotive, arms, big items. The industrial robots in 2014, they cost about $9.5 million a piece. They made up the predominance of the market value. The #1 producer of industrial robots in 2014, Japan. About 35% of industrial robots were made in Japan. The #1 consumer of industrial robots back in 2014 was Japan, followed by South Korea very closely. In 2014, there were 200,000 new robots delivered. Remember some of these numbers, so 200,000 in 2014. The forecast was into 2019 that in fact it was going to be a pretty steady growth into 2019. The service robots, because of Moore's Law, miniaturization, were going to become more of a market segment, but not significantly so. It was going to grow some. And in fact, the industrial robots would continue on the same trajectory. So in 2014, that's kind of the robotics environment. The forecast was, I'll give this to you again later so you don't have to remember the number. The forecast was that by this year, the robotics market was going to be worth $45 billion. In 2014, I shared with you that both the robotics market as well as the unmanned systems market and the forecasts that were made, from my experience in this area for nearly 2 decades, my experience was those forecasts were totally and significantly under-targeted. I'm going to give you a peek under the tent. I was right. There were also changes in the market that happened between 2014 and where we are now, 2019, and we'll talk about that a little bit when I talk about 2019. So let's go to unmanned systems. Unmanned systems, aircraft systems, maritime system, ground systems. In 2014, the global market for unmanned systems, you ready? $6 billion. Not close to the robot. And you may argue, say, well, Grant, why did you call that a revolution? Because of my experience in this business domain. And I'll give you a snapshot. When I stood up joint unmanned systems with the Department of Defense, this is not to talk about Department of Defense, but I think it's an indicator. In 1993, there were a total of 33 drones in all of DoD's inventory in 1993. And I had a budget of $200 million. That budget of $200 million wasn't for the 33 drones. It was congressional plus-up money to go buy drones, stick them in the inventory, and see if the military operators would like these things and move forward with it. So that was in 1993. Those 33 drones, by the way, those drones were purchased by the U.S. government from Israel. Israel in 1993 was the global leader for the development of unmanned aerial systems, drones. So we had those 33 drones in the inventory. By 2003, that inventory had grown from 33 to 167. And the budget had grown from $200 million to $350 million. And that was over a period of a decade. And oh, by the way, the 167 drones that were in inventory, those included the 33 Pioneers that were in inventory 10 years earlier. So how is that a revolution? Now let's go forward another 10 years. Because the users in 2003, they had the opportunity to start using those drones, the 167. In the next 10 years, this is to take you to 2013. This was the year before I came to INCOSE, 2014. I shared these numbers with you. The inventory had grown from 167 to over 12,000 in 10 years. The budget had grown from $350 million to $3.9 billion. The inventory for the Department of Defense of unmanned aerial systems exceeded the inventory for manned aircraft. In 2013, the U.S. Air Force was training more unmanned, remotely piloted pilots than they were manned pilots. And that is a trajectory that continues today. And oh, by the way, with that budget and the unmanned aerial systems exceeding manned systems, the budget for unmanned aerial systems was only 8% of the entire DoD aviation budget. So what you get is a lot for your money. Now, the predominance of those drones I shared with you in 2014 were small drones. They weren't the big global hawks with a wingspan of a 737. They weren't the Predators. And contrary to general public awareness or perception, the Department of Defense doesn't have a lot of lethal drones. That's a very small portion of the Department of Defense drone inventory. The majority do other things. They carry cargo. They do surveillance. They're not armed drones, but just a data point. But my point being is the revolution. Think about it. Over 20 years, 33, 167 to over 12,000, and that was back in 2013. That was the number in 2013. And what's the Department of Defense doing now? What's the inventory for drones in the Department of Defense? I don't know, because the Department of Defense doesn't publish that anymore, oh, by the way. So interesting, but I tell you the budget's going to indicate the Department of Defense is buying a lot more drones, and I'll share with you in a second. So back in 2014, Department of Defense is really driving the drone industry. There was $6 billion. Of that $6 billion, global unmanned systems, this is ground systems, maritime systems, of that $6 billion, the Department of Defense's budget was $4.1 billion of the $6 billion, and that represented mostly unmanned aerial systems. So a little bit of unmanned ground systems, a little bit of unmanned maritime systems, and there were other unmanned systems in the commercial sector, but they didn't really drive that budget number. And the forecast in 2014 was that this year, the budget for drones was going to grow from $6 billion to $9 billion. The number's way off. I'll give you that information here in a little while, too. In 2014, the predominant commercial drone at the time I shared with you was a drone that's made by Yamaha, a Japanese company. And you think of Yamaha, you think of pianos, you think of off-road vehicles, outboard engines, but Yamaha, in partnership with the Japanese government in the late 1990s, developed a small helicopter, weighs about 250 pounds, and to do precision agriculture. And the reason the Japanese government, as the initiative for this, did so was because the Japanese government was concerned of the aging population in Japan, the need to maintain agriculture as a basis in Japan into the 2000, 2010, there needed to be a supplement to the aging population. So the initiative to develop and then produce and then use what is referred to as the Yamaha's RMAX. In 2014, RMAX had about 3,000 operational vehicles to do precision agriculture in Japan, some in Cambodia, some in Vietnam, other places. 3,000 vehicles. They don't sell them. They were leased services. And in fact, in 2014, Yamaha was before the FAA in the United States and also the Department of Commerce requesting permission to start precision agriculture in the US. In 2014, I shared with you as a board member for the Association of Unmanned Vehicle Systems International that AUVSI had conducted a study to determine the biggest mover for commercial unmanned aerial systems in the United States. And that biggest mover was determined objectively. It was going to be precision agriculture. And the market would be worth $800 million this year using commercial unmanned aerial vehicles to support agriculture in the United States. Now keep that in mind. There was a company I mentioned to you in 2014 that had started providing recreational drones because of Moore's Law, miniaturization. You could go out and buy a drone in 2014 that was a little quad rotor. And in fact, the company I mentioned in 2014 was a company, DJI, Chinese company. They started in 2006, publicly traded company, made no money in 2007. 2008 turned their first profit. And in 2014, I reported to you DJI's profit from the previous year, which was $500 million, selling recreational drones that were also being used to do photography for the photo industry and the movie industry. So they started to creep into this commercial area that hadn't really been established yet. So they started to form. And the company had a market valuation at that time, 2014, $5 billion with a revenue of $500 million. Started from nothing to grow. And they represented at the time over 70% of all recreational and commercial drones sold worldwide. So two commercial entities, Yamaha, DJI, 2014. How about on the ground vehicles? The most prevalent ground vehicle in 2014 were automated or robotic trucks in Australia. I shared with you that Australia had initiated 2 years prior an endeavor to have 400-ton class working in the mining industry, taking the drivers out, automating those vehicles. There were 200 vehicles in the inventory in 2014, and they were performing marvelously as sort of a beta test, and that was 2014. In the maritime environment, there were sea gliders, and the sea gliders were being used by NOAA and other organizations that are doing research and experimentation at sea, and the sea gliders would go out, they would ride the waves, generate energy within the sea glider from the waves, go down, measure the salinity of the oceans, look at sea mammals, animals, provide that information. They would stay out for 2 or 3 months at a time before being recovered. So that's kind of the environment in 2014. Also, I want to point out in 2014, if you were here in the United States, if you turned on the news, if you listened to the media, at the time, it was doom and gloom that the drones were going to be the end of all because they were going to run into commercial aircraft, knock them out of the sky, somebody was going to die, and they were going to evade our privacy. And in 2014, the FAA in the United States had no rulemaking in place for drones. And that was a point of contention. AUVSI, working to Congress, was trying to help the FAA to establish a framework for the rulemaking, and it was a struggle because the FAA was really anchored in manned aviation. From a cultural perspective, they were struggling to figure out how to deal with these drones. And the way they figured it out was not to integrate the drones in the national airspace, but segregate the drones, try to keep them out of the national airspace. That's 2014. Also in 2014, relevant is that since the FAA was doing no rulemaking, at the state level, there was concern that the drones were going to evade the states. They were going to, be disastrous in the states. So states started to develop their own legislation of how to control the drones. And the Association of Unmanned Vehicle Systems International, as I was a Florida resident, asked me to be the AUVSI Legislative Committee Chairman for the state of Florida to positively, ethically, responsibly affect Florida legislation for the control of unmanned aerial systems, automated vehicles, and otherwise, anything unmanned, anything automated. So that was a task I was tasked with in 2014. So let's fast forward now. Here we are today. So where is the robotics market today? Remember the forecast? $29 billion back in 2014, and the market was going to grow to $45 billion by this year. Off mark. $62 billion. And what's interesting, too, is in 2014, the forecast was this year there would be 350,000 robots delivered globally. That number's off also. The International Federation of Robotics believes that number by the end of this year will be 1.2 million robots, not 350,000. But why the big swing, and the number's not any bigger than it is? Because the service robots have become more prevalent than was expected. The service robots have grown faster. They're being embraced and they're being used more than the Federation had expected or other forecasters for this year. So for example, what was not forecast back in 2014? The big splash by medical robots. This year alone, a $10 billion market for medical robots. And what's a medical robot? A medical robot assists surgeons in surgery. It's a very predictable surgery. It's like an appendectomy. It's removing a bladder, gallbladder. It's do a kidney. And in fact, in 2014, after I spoke at INCOSE in Nevada, I came back home, came back here to Florida, and I was invited as a special guest to the International Institute of Robotic Surgery, which is about 5 miles south of here. The Da Vinci robots are there for the robotic surgery. And in fact, I even had the opportunity to do, I'm not Dr. Begley, but to do robotic surgery on some dead animals, but to take my hand in it. And this was international training because the Robotics Institute south of here is not just for the US. Da Vinci had been introduced. In 2014, it was being used, but in limited capacity, and the revolution was spreading. That in fact, these robotic tools, the Da Vinci, $2 million a copy, surgery took less time, less invasive, recovery time was rapid, more rapid, and less problems. And so that was the beginning of the robotic medical surgery. $10 billion market value this year, and it's expected to expand. It wasn't even forecasted back in 2014. So in 2014, the market expands to where it is right now, $62 billion, and the forecast is going to 2024, it's going to double again. So the forecast for 2024, $125 billion, and the service robot basis is going to expand even further. And the contributing factors are the following. Due to technology and good systems engineering that is making the service robots better and less expensive, service robots right now cost an average about $20,000 for a service robot or a cobot. And the service robot has a life expectancy of about 5 to 10 years. And unlike the industrial robots that had a return of investment of 3 to 5 years, the cobots, the industrial robots, long payback, expensive, $9 million if you recall. These cobots, these service robots, $20,000, and the payback, the return on investment, is in months, not years. And what's driving the service robot market also is the floor for base pay is coming up, and the cost of the robots is coming down. And guess what? The robots don't get sick. They don't call in sick. They're very predictable. They don't have to have a pension. And so companies, businesses are buying these robots faster and more than ever before. You probably have seen some of the advertisements with Amazon, and this was a discussion we had in 2014. Is Amazon really going to deliver packages by aerial? And Amazon, since 2014, has still been struggling with the FAA, trying to get their Amazon Prime, get their aviation package delivery into place. But what goes with that is Amazon has done very specific analysis that has determined that the majority, 85% of Amazon's package deliveries are a trip of less than 7 miles, and the packages weigh less than 5 pounds. So the predominance of Amazon package deliveries, they've determined, can be done by air delivery, drone delivery. Amazon hopes, as they've been working on this challenge with the FAA since 2014, Amazon hopes that this month that they will get the authorization from the FAA to start doing limited package delivery, and the location for that hasn't been announced yet. But go back to robots. Have you seen any of the video of the Amazon fulfillment centers? And this is where the packages are packed up and moved around in the Amazon fulfillment centers. The Amazon fulfillment centers are just a buzz with these little ground, and I'll call them, they're not unmanned ground vehicles, they're robots. And they're working very automated, they're not autonomous, and they are running packages around these fulfillment centers like you could not believe. So this is a revolution. Again, those are kind of like service robots. That is, the genie's out of the bottle, it's moving forward. So with unmanned aerial systems, where are we for the unmanned aerial systems? In the forecast, or I say unmanned systems, in the forecast, so back 2014, $6 billion, forecast going to grow to $9 billion. Where are we this year? $18 billion is the global unmanned systems budget. Tellingly, is if you recall back when the budget or the market value was $6 billion in 2014, the US federal government, the Department of Defense, that $6 billion represented close to $5 billion, about 5/6 of that budget back in 2014. Of the $18 billion actual market value this year, the Department of Defense just released, or they're still in staffing, for their 2020 budget, which begins on the 1st of October. Of the 2020 budget, $10 billion, just under $10 billion, is like 9.85. But what's telling of that $10 billion Department of Defense budget for unmanned systems, unlike 2014, of the $10 billion, I'll use 10, $5 billion of it is for unmanned aerial systems, $2 billion for unmanned ground systems, $2 billion for unmanned maritime systems, and $1 billion for counter unmanned systems. Think about that. So there was nothing, there was a little bit back in 2014, but $1 billion to go to counter unmanned systems. Very telling. And as citizens and part of the systems engineering community, you're probably aware that some of the concerns from a security perspective, national level, your countries, and then the local level, what if there's a bad actor using one of these off-the-shelf drones in a public environment, soccer game, otherwise? And so a new concern, but a growing budget for counter unmanned systems. Again, as systems engineers, as leaders, I encourage you, I implore you, you get three choices in this revolution. You can either participate, observe, or be oblivious. Don't be oblivious. I encourage you to participate because you're in a prestigious position to do so. So again, back to the unmanned systems market, the Department of Defense still is a strong arming, a big part of that international unmanned systems market. Whatever happened to DJI? Remember back in 2014, they had a 2013 revenue of $500 million, pretty impressive, represented nearly 3/4 of the budget globally for recreational and then emerging commercial drones. The numbers for DJI last year, 2018, $2.9 billion. Yeah, $2.9 billion. They had a market value, capital value, back in 2014 of $5 billion. Their market capitalization value now is $15 billion. DJI is the leader in delivering personal use, recreational drones, and they continue to expand in the commercial market. Their drones, since they have been so profitable and they have been so innovative in this emerging environment of technology, they have eclipsed where we had thought in our forecasting Yamaha would be with their commercial agricultural drones. So Yamaha from 2014 to where we are now, they've grown a little, not much. Where AUVSI, and I shared with you back in 2014, we thought that in the US, the agricultural market was going to be worth $800 million by this year. It's not. The reason it's not is because the FAA has been very good about keeping the handcuffs on the commercialization of drones. The drones still are not allowed integration into the national airspace. On a case-by-case basis, they're given an exemption by the FAA that they can go operate in a small spot. But in 2014, when there were zero grants from the FAA for any commercial operations. This year there's over 200,000. So the good news is there's commercial operations. In fact, I received an email yesterday. I live here locally. Received the email from Florida Power that there would be drones in my area where I live inspecting power lines. So very, very interesting. And so where has the drone market grown in the United States? We thought it was going to be agriculture. It hasn't. It has been in photography, and it's been in surveying, it's mine surveying, it's buildings. The drones are being used for inspection towers. Companies that we didn't think would emerge in the drone industry have emerged very impressively. These are companies like Intel and Microsoft. If you go down here to Disney World, you'll see demonstrations. Instead of fireworks, they're drones, 100, 200 drones working in concert to provide the sky environment. The drones were used during the Olympics in China, and they're used in concert instead of used in fireworks. So the drones are catching on, the unmanned aerial systems are catching on, and the commercial sector as well as the recreational sector. The forecast for 2024 is that the drone market, unmanned aerial systems market, will grow from today, there's the $18 billion, that's all unmanned systems. Of that, about $14 billion is unmanned aerial systems. That market's going to grow to $100 billion by 2024, and it's going to be driven by the commercial and recreational use drone community, growing significantly. So that's the forecast going into 2024. Let's go back and look at unmanned maritime systems. I mentioned that we had the sea gliders back in 2014, and they were out there for experimentation, research, and development. The sea gliders haven't advanced very much. But interestingly enough, last week in Washington, D.C., there was a conference. And the conference, similar to this conference, was unmanned maritime systems, unmanned shipping. From an international perspective, there's a thing called coal regs that governs the at-sea operations. The maritime industry is very much proactive in unmanning ships, big ships. These aren't the passenger ships, these are cargo ships. And the unmanning of the cargo ships is going to allow a ship pilot, so this would be from a departure point, to take the ship out to where the pilot would normally get off. Then the ship goes on automated transit, transits the Atlantic, transits the Pacific, goes to the next port of entry. The pilot gets on at the port of entry, and the ship does the last mile with somebody on board. That is where the maritime industry has gone, a big deal. And oh, by the way, that is going to be a system. And so again, a system of systems opportunity. Also, in 2014, what we missed, what I missed, the industry missed, there was a conversation about autonomous vehicles, driverless cars. In 2014, there were initiatives that were underway to provide driverless cars to our advantage. The forecasts were that by 2024, we may see the emergence of driverless cars. That's been pulled to the left. And oh, by the way, with all the pushback I've had in my professional career about the introduction of unmanned aerial systems into controlled airspace, I thought from a national perspective, this is in the US, that the Department of Transportation and state rules and regulations would absolutely push back even harder about having driverless cars on our highways, shared with us as we're driving. I hadn't expected what happened, and so now not only are there driverless cars, autonomous vehicles on the road already, the forecast is for the major providers, whether it's Uber, Ford, General Motors, Mercedes, they are on their own timelines to have their first autonomous vehicles available for us to buy, and it depends on which of these car manufacturers you're with, as early as 2021, 2022, 2023. Today, as we speak, in Lake Nona, which is just on the other side of the Orlando National Airport, there are several autonomous public vehicles that started operation last month. And these vehicles, public transportation, they're not automated. They're driving around downtown Lake Nona, and they're delivering passengers at various locations. They're not on a track. They're fully autonomous. And it's provided by a company called Beep. And in fact, just last month, before the vehicle started operation, the local fire department and rescue squad went down to run, I guess you call them exercises. What happens is one of these vehicles gets stuck in traffic or just quits running. How do you drive it? How do you move it besides getting a wrecker and dragging it off? So with like a little iPad, they have to plug it into a USB port, and that's how the emergency response teams can move these vehicles. They are in operation today over in Lake Nona, not personal use, this is public use. The 1st of July of this year, I'm pleased to report, that state legislation in the state of Florida passed legislation that on any public road in the state of Florida, autonomous vehicles are allowed. And there's special conditions. And the autonomous vehicles are allowed without a licensed driver in the vehicle. Now there's special considerations. How do you insure it? How do you sue if something goes wrong? But right now, autonomous vehicles allowed on the roads in Florida. Also, just south of here is SunTrack, T-R-A-C. And SunTrack is the first global, specifically built public-private site to allow the development and the certification of autonomous vehicles, 18-wheel trucks, driverless cars. They finished the first phase. The 2.25-mile oval track is done down there. Last month, on the Florida Turnpike, just miles from here, an 18-wheeler tractor-trailer did a 10-mile run autonomously down the Florida Turnpike during regular operating hours to pull into a rest stop, park in the rest stop autonomously. There was a driver on board monitoring, pull back out on the rest stop, continue down the turnpike. Next year, in coordination with the Florida Department of Transportation and in support of SunTrax, there will be convoys of driverless trucks transiting from here down to Miami and back, trailing on each other, 18-wheelers. The unmanned revolution, the robotics revolution, is underway. And it is going to be huge. It is ubiquitous and will touch every one of your lives. So as parents, as grandparents, as professionals, I encourage you to be a participant, which I'm sure many of you are. Don't be spectators. As I started my conversation, I'm honored to be here. I am privileged to be here because I know many of you are contributing to this revolution. Hang on, contribute, and again, thank you very much for the opportunity to come back. Open the floor for questions.